In Utah, between 1865 to 72, many members of the Ute tribe were at war with white settlers, and the militiamen formed to protect them. The war consisted of around 150 battles, raids, or engagements over 7 years. Outnumbered around 25 to 1, the Ute warriors developed deadly hit-and-run tactics and perfected the art of the ambush either when on the offensive or when they withdrawing or retreating. These tactics and the Ute warriors' culture of mutilating the dead caused the mostly Mormon settlers to abandon large areas of southern and central Utah during this time. The Ute warriors had a different warrior culture to other tribes. These warriors didn't seek honor from daring acts of individual bravery and didn't have any recognized war honors in their tribe. The Ute warriors were more like a modern soldiers, using small numbers, stealth, surprise, and firepower to win victories. They were careful not to incur casualties and would avoid senseless contact with the enemy unless it was on their terms. All up, the warriors at war only numbered around 100 men. The militiamen tasked to fight them numbered around 2,500 men. The warriors were very well armed, much better than the militiamen. Some had Enfield rifles, while some even carried the brand new and expensive Henry repeating rifle. It's not known how they obtained these weapons or the large amount of ammunition that they had with them, but some at the time suspected government Indian agents were arming the warriors in their fight with the Mormons. The warriors were experts at delaying tactics when being followed and knew the ideal time and place to ambush. In 1867, the men of Glenwood, who were building a fort just outside town, went each morning along the same road to work on it. The Indians watched this routine, and during the night they occupied the area along the road. They built sturdy breastworks of rocks in the brush between Glenwood and the fort. These camouflaged fortified points zigzagged down the road and provided a lethal killing zone that the unsuspecting workmen would walk into. Fortunately for the men of Glenwood, a Ute warrior gave away their ambush position when he fired on a lone man out collecting his horses that morning. Once their cover was blown, they vanished back into the mountains, leaving behind their handiwork. A night ambush on April 22, 1866, gives an example of how daring and lethal the Braves were. Around 20 militiamen had been pursuing a smaller Ute war party. The warriors had run off cattle and thus were moving slowly and were easily followed. Aided by a bright moon, the soldiers found the cattle now abandoned close to Fort Marysvale. The men decided they would eat at the fort before continuing the pursuit. Walking up to the entrance, they slung their rifles and let their guard down, and when just 20 yards from safety, a volley of rifles boomed directly behind them. The Ute warriors had anticipated the soldiers would stop at the fort and stealthily set up an ambush on the road at the gates. Many soldiers were killed and injured, while all the Ute warriors escaped into the night. The warriors also used terror against their enemies. After one raid on March 30th, 1867, H. Kearns wrote to his friend, "There was one man, his name was James P. Peterson, age 30 years, and his wife Caroline Peterson, age 27 years. Also, a girl named Mary Smith, aged 16 years. The man had been shot and considerably mutilated. The woman was scalped and cut up in a most brutal manner. A portion of the lower part of her body was cut out and laid upon her face. The girl was also scalped and badly cut up, with a stick ran up about 10 inches into her privates." When Soren Jesperson was killed on October 17, 1865, near Ephraim, N. Anderson said, "It appeared that he had been fearfully tortured while yet alive. His hands and feet were chopped off, and also the upper part of his head." In July 1865, another man in a cabin near the town of Moroni said late one night his dog, that was tied up to the wall outside, was making a fuss. The man then listened to the unmistakable sound of arrows thumping against the wall near the dog. The thumping continued intermittently all night. He said that in the morning, when he finally ventured outside, the cabin wall was feathered with arrows, and amazingly, his dog was still alive and very happy to see him. Were known for making powerful and quality bows. After a raid near Ephraim in October, 17-year-old Elizabeth Peterson was found dead with an arrow that went completely through her chest, protruding most of the way out her opposite side. But not all bows were this lethal, In a raid on Salina on April 13, 1866, Emil Nielsen, a boy of 11, was hit in the right arm and left side by arrows. He fell, and his attacker, a little Indian boy, then tried to kill him by shooting arrows into his head. Emil was hit 3 times, but luckily for Emil, none of the arrows penetrated his skull and he survived. Shooting skills were always practiced by young Ute warriors. Many became excellent marksmen. At Gravelly Ford on June 11, 1866, to help his comrades escape, a solitary Indian held off a group of cavalrymen fully 50 strong by riding in an oblong circle and firing as he reached the point nearest the enemy. He reloaded his rifle while on the home stretch and on returning was ready for another shot. On September 21, 1865, men of the Sanpete militia were ambushed near Red Lake. The Indians overshot their enemies, but the rounds hit the lake behind them so rapidly the water seemed to boil. As good as the warriors were in battle, after years of fighting, their successful campaign helped in their demise. As the country emptied of settlers, scared of being scalped, the settlers took with them livestock, an Indian staple at this time. Hunger, along with the arrival of federal troops, eventually brought the Utes to their knees, and in 1872, the war was over.
The Great Father at Washington sent representatives out to our country. The Indians met them and held a council. The Sioux were the hereditary enemies of the Crows. The headman sent by the Great Father said to the Crows, "We must get together and fight and get this land from the Sioux. We must win it by conquest." We called the officer, who was lame, No Hip Bone. The officer was General Terry. We loved our land, so we consented to go in with the soldiers and put these other tribes off the land. No Hip Bone took me in the winter time, and I went with him wherever he wanted me to go until the next summer. During this journey I had a good horse. The Sioux took it away from me and I was left to go on foot, so I put my gun on my shoulder and marched with the soldiers. I thought that I was a man and had confidence in myself that I was right, and so I kept up with the soldiers. I endured all the hardships the soldiers endured in order to hold my land. We had hardships climbing mountains, fording rivers, frost and cold of winter, the burning heat of summer. My bones ache today from the exposure, but it was all for love of my home. I stood faithfully by the soldiers. They did not know the country. I did. They wanted me for their eye. They could not see. The soldiers were the same as though they were blind, and I used both of my own eyes for them. The soldiers and I were fighting in friendship. What they said, I did. What I said, they did. So I helped my tribe. Land is a very valuable thing, and especially our land. I knew the Cheyennes and Sioux wanted to take it by conquest, so I stayed with the soldiers to help hold it. No Hip Bone moved to Tongue River at the time the leaves were getting full. We heard that General Custer was coming, and I and 30 soldiers went down the river in boats. 2 scouts, Elk and 2 Whistles, were with me. At the junction of the Yellowstone with the Missouri River, we met Custer. I was the first one of the Crows to shake hands with General Custer. He gripped me by the hand tight and said, "You are the one I want to see, and I am glad that you are first." We went into the steamboat with General Custer, and he pointed out different places to me as objects of interest. I directed Custer up to No Hip Bone, who had moved to the mouth of the Little Rosebud. They had a council. Bonnie Bravo was their interpreter. General Custer said to the interpreter, pointing to me, "This is the kind of man we want for this campaign, and I want some others also." Goes ahead. Hairy Moccasin, White Swan, paints his face yellow, and Curly were chosen. There were 6 of us all together. The others were sent back. We always moved ahead of Custer. We were his pilots. We always traveled at night, climbing the mountains and wading the rivers. During the day, we made a concealed camp. We traveled in this way several days before we reached the Sioux camp. When we reached the top of the Wolf Mountains, we saw the enemy's camp near where the Custer field is at the present time. Harry Moccasin, Goes Ahead, Curly, and myself saw the camp. Custer had halted at the foot of a mountain, and we all went back and told Custer that we had seen a big camp, and it was close. Custer was rejoiced and anxious to go ahead and make the battle. The sun was just peeping when we saw the camp. It was 8 or 9 o'clock when we scouts all went ahead again. We got close to the place of the enemy's camp, and Custer divided the scouts, sent some across the river, and the others remained on the hill. In the meantime, Custer had divided his command. Yellowface and White Swan went with Reno across the river. Goes Ahead, Harry Moccasin, Curly, and myself remained with Custer. Custer sent me to a high knoll. He said, "Go and look for me and see where I can make a success." He left it to me. When I was up there, I looked around and the troops were very close upon me, and I motioned to them to come on, and we passed up onto the ridge. The Indian scouts stood in front of Custer and led his men. We went down to the Little Horn until we came to a little coulee and were moving towards the enemy's camp. We wanted to cross the river at that place. The Sioux fired at us. We then went up the hill to the ridge. I was all along the ridge where the fight was raging. We looked over the river and saw Reno in his engagement with the Sioux. Finally, they wiped out Reno, and he retreated to the hills. Custer and all of us got off our horses here. At that time, the enemy was surrounding us. They were banging away at us. We had a heavy skirmish. Custer then came up and said, "You have done your duty. You have led me to the enemy's camp. And now the thing for you to do is to obey my orders and get away." Farther on, up the river, was a pack train escorted by 300 soldiers, and I made my way to the pack train, and I found the Indians there fighting. Custer, when he told me to go, said, "You go. I am now going with my boys." Had Custer not ordered me to go, the people who visit the Custer field today would see my name on the monument. When I got back to the pack train, I directed them back to where the old trenches are today, and where you may still see a pile of bones. The Indians had killed all the mules when I got there. The fight lasted through the whole of a long, hot summer day. My friends, the soldiers who were with Custer, were all wiped out. When the sun went down, I was about exhausted, and I had no clothes on save a breechclout. All the scouts were dressed like myself. When night came on, exhausted as we scouts went down the river to meet No Hip Bone. We reached him early the next morning. There was a terrific rainstorm all night long. I had no clothes on, and I stuck to my wet horse. My horse was so exhausted that he stumbled on through the night, and today I feel the effects of it. It was my nature to endure. From a boy I had been trained to endure, but as strong as I was, it wounded me for life. We met No Hip Bone and told him that up the river yesterday, when the sun was midway between morning and noon, until the sun was midway between noon and night, the Indians had killed Custer and all of his command, and he was mad. We told him that our horses' hoofs were worn out and asked permission to go back home and get fresh horses. He said, "Yes, you can go, but come back. Meanwhile, I will travel up the river and see the dead soldiers." I went to Pryor, our Crow camp. Custer and the soldiers were my friends and companions, and I cried all night long as I rode through the rain to tell No Hip Bone the news. When we were at the Rosebud, General Custer and his staff held a council as to what we should do when we found the enemy's camp, as to whether we should attack by day or night. I said we had better fight by night. Paints His Face Yellow said, "Let us attack by day, so that we can see what we are doing." I thought I was laying a good plan for them, but they listened to Yellowface. General Custer was a brave and good man, a straightforward and honest man. When General Custer took me by the hand, patted me on the shoulder, and I looked him in the face, I said, "There is a good general. If General Custer was living today, I would get better treatment than I now receive." General Custer said, "Where does your tribe stay?" And I told him in the valley through which Pryor Creek runs, along the Bighorn River at Lodge Grass, and in the valley of the Little Horn, there is my home. Custer said, "If I die, you will get this land back and stay there, happy and contented, and if you die, you will be buried on your own land." When I joined General Custer, I had full confidence in myself and my ability to help him. And for this reason I joined Custer, so that I might help hold my land against our enemies, the Sioux and the Cheyennes. After the Custer battle, when we had obtained fresh horses, I took the other scouts with me, and we went over the field and looked at the remains of the dead soldiers who were my friends and companions. Knowing the country, I always directed General Custer to the best places to ford the river and the easiest way to climb the hills, that he might reach the path of success. After the loss of my horse, I traveled on foot with the soldiers and was willing even to go down to death with Custer in order that I might help him. White man runs him.
The word spur comes from the Old Anglo-Saxon spura, spora, spurnen, which loosely means to kick or urge on. The earliest spur examples were made of bone or wood, but later ones consisted of various metals. The spurs that cowboys fitted to their boots had a spiked round rowel attached to a metal heel band. Spurs were secured by small chains. These chains, the rowel, along with decorative pendants, made a jingle-jangle sound as they moved. The spurs were used to prod a horse into quick action. Spurs were made with all manner of decoration, and the design of spurs used varied over different regions. Original spurs from the era of the Wild West are now quite collectible. Some collectors have hundreds of different types in their collections. If you listen carefully to our music introduction, you can hear the jingle of spurs in the background.